Good evening from our headquarters in Kyiv. This is This Sunday Show at Hromadske International, the only prime-time program explaining Eastern European geopolitical storm in English, and I'm Natalia Humenyuk. This week, Ukraine had found itself in the midst of the international crisis and in particularly U.S. Inner domestic political crisis after we had found that the President Trump tried to pressure the Ukrainian President Zelensky to investigate his political rivals here in Ukraine. A lot had been said. We probably most of the audience of this program had looked at the notes of the declassified conversation between the presidents, in which none of them looked good. But we're trying to find out not just what is next, but what is real, what are the things to care and to look further. And for this, we have a brilliant panel, and both in Kyiv, but also on Skype from different capitals. So we have Daria Kalenyuk, who is an executive director of the Anti-Corruption Action Center, who used to investigate Burisma company, the company the son-in-law of Joe Biden was involved way before it was on the global media. Also, we have with us Andriy Veselovsky, who is the well-known Ukrainian diplomat and former deputy foreign minister in mid-2000. Good evening.
Good evening.
We'll be joined by Sergii Leshchenko, a Ukrainian former MP, who is also found himself to be a part of the scandal. And via Skype, we will talk to Frank Foer, an American journalist from DC, who is a writer on The Atlantic, as well Andy Kramer, who is a New York Times columnist, and Marie Mandra, who is one of the best political analysts in France, to also discuss how the whole scandal will influence the Ukrainian relations with European states. But probably let's start the discussion why you find it, I think in particular, the audience of the show had looked at the notes, discussed a lot. But what do you think the foreign audience in particular need to know at this stage?
Well, first of all, foreign audience has to understand facts. The fact on Shokin, the prosecutor who was good according to Trump, is that Shokin was not good prosecutor. Shokin was corrupt prosecutor, and we demanded his resignation months before Joe Biden came here and asked Ukrainian authorities to get him out of the office. Second fact, Shokin was not willing to investigate Burisma, the company where Hunter Biden was in the advisory board. And we have all documented evidence proving that. I'm following this case since 2014. I remember that in April 2014 in London, there was Asset Recovery Forum where law enforcement agencies from across the world gathered together and met with Ukrainian counterparts, with Ukrainian prosecutors, with Ukrainian investigators in a response to Ukrainian citizens calling for asset recovery of process of corruption of Yanukovych. And that was the place when first there was announced that United Kingdom seized $23.5 million of company which was closely associated with Yanukovych. They didn't mention the name of the company, so we didn't know that it was Burisma or there was a Zlochevsky. But it actually when it all started. And then British law enforcement investigated this case further and asked for help from Ukrainian law enforcement agencies. And Shokin at that time was Deputy Prosecutor General. Unfortunately, Ukrainian Prosecutor General did not provide evidence which British law enforcement needed, but quite to the contrary, they provided evidence, they provided a document to attorney of Burisma and Zlochevsky that there is no suspicions of Zlochevsky in PGO office, and this document was given to the court in London and was one of the key grounds for unseizing $23.5 million. So, and even after that, British law enforcement, they tried to pursue the case and no help was coming from Shokin. So that was the reason why I'm convinced that Shokin was not willing to investigate this case. He was dumping this case. And the third fact, which is important to understand here, I don't like what Hunter Biden did. I think that he should not have taken this job. when his father was a deputy, was a vice president, he should not have taken a job of the very shady Ukrainian company. But there was no investigation of activities of Hunter Biden in these cases which PGO had under Shokin. The activities which were investigated in these cases were dated of 2010, 2012 until 2014. And Hunter Biden joined the company in end April, May 2014. So these are three facts which is important to understand.
Ambassador, this is quite a scandal which will influence most probably Ukrainian-US relations. What do you think how Ukraine can act now? And as an experienced diplomat, how usual is this kind of conversation between the presidents?
Well, it depends on the presidents. Some of them try to talk absolutely confidentially, and this was a particular case. Normally, presidents do not call to one to another just right away. These questions these questions normally go through diplomatic channel. A diplomat from, say, Washington tells to his counterpart in Kyiv that our president will call your president in a day or in 2 hours. And then it gives time to the team of the other president to prepare and to have predictable answers to predictable questions. Obviously, it was not the case. American part made a call without talking to their own team, and that is why Ukrainian team didn't know maybe about the call itself. From the recent words of Prosecutor General Barr of United States, we learned that American president did not tell him about his interest to involve him into affair between Ukraine and the United States. So why asking President Zelensky on July 25 to be helpful to American Prosecutor General? American president was not telling the truth. So bad story begins always when one or both parties do not tell the truth, and the results are here.
We will discuss that, but before we get into the call, I also would like to show the quote. I know that many of us had watched, many of you had read the notes, but in particular to remind the quote which is considered to be the ones which may put the President Trump in the position of possible impeachment.
I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot and Ukraine knows a lot about it. I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation with Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike. I guess you have one of your wealthy people. The server, they say Ukraine has it. There are a lot of things that went on, the whole situation. I think you're surrounding yourself with some of the same people. I would like to have the Attorney General call you or your people, and I would like you to get to the bottom of it. As you saw yesterday, the whole nonsense ended with a very poor performance by a man named Robert Mueller, an incompetent performance. But they say a lot of it started with Ukraine. Whatever you can do, it's very important that you do it if that's possible.
Yes, it is very important for me, and everything that you just mentioned earlier. For me as a president, it's very important, and we are open for any future cooperation. We are ready to open a new page in cooperation in relations between the United States and Ukraine. For that purpose, I just recalled our ambassador from the United States, and he will be replaced by a very competent and a very experienced ambassador who will work hard on making sure that our two nations are getting closer.
Just to be very brief, I still want you to remark this kind of conversation, to what extent you think it harms Ukrainian-US relations?
Ukrainian president was rather supportive of some thesis of President Trump, which were not substantiated. And this is not good.
So we have with us on the line from Washington, D.C., Franklin Foer, who is the writer of The Atlantic and who was the first American journalist to investigate the whole story about Paul Manafort actions here in Ukraine. All those stories are connected since, of course, the President Trump team, and in particular Rudy Giuliani, his lawyer, tries to substitute the first scandal, the Russian involvement in the U.S. elections, into the as if it was the Ukrainian involvement. So, Frank, do you hear us?
I do.
Okay, good to have you in line. So, of course, there are a few days everybody is discussing the case, but really, to what extent do you think that could lead to a possible impeachment? To what extent the whole how Ukraine is seen in the U.S. In particular in this case, and what also I would mention in this declassified conversation, also the President Trump mentioned that the prosecutor Barr, the American prosecutor Barr, could be involved. Is it really okay? What are other details to be seen in this whole conversation?
Well, first of all, I think it should be said that the Democrats have been looking for an opportunity to impeach Donald Trump because the man has behaved in a consistently lawless sort of way, and he's violated so many of the norms of American democracy that there was this sense that he needed to be checked. He needed to be brought back into line, and they hadn't made any sort of move to impeachment until the whistleblower came forward, and they had a clear sense that there was kind of evidence that you really couldn't question that Trump had violated American constitutional norms in a very clear sort of way. And so when the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, decided to open impeachment proceedings into the president, she had waited till a moment where she could be sure of the outcome in the part of the government that she controlled. So the Democrats have a majority in the House of Representatives, and it seems like the entirety of the Democratic caucus in the House of Representatives is going to vote to impeach Trump based on the evidence that they have right now. So that happens. And then we really don't know what happens when the impeachment proceedings move into the second body, into the Senate, where it seems highly unlikely that Trump will be removed from office simply because the Republicans have the numbers there. And there's really no evidence that the Republicans will move in any significant numbers against Trump. In fact, there's maybe only one or two Republicans who've seemed remotely open to the possibility that he did something of extreme gravity, of extreme seriousness. You mentioned Attorney General William Barr, and his involvement in the case is very troubling for two separate reasons. The first is that when the whistleblower came forward and said that the president was doing something troubling, the case was referred to the Department of Justice, and they declined to prosecute it. And Barr, who's mentioned in the transcripts, did nothing to recuse himself from the process. And so, at the very least, that poses the possibility that there was a conflict of interest there and that he didn't abide by the rules and regulations of the Department of Justice in the way that he handled the case. More broadly, I think what's so deeply troubling to Americans about this is the way in which the President of the United States is using the machinery of state to punish a political opponent. And the Department of Justice is supposed to be the most neutral part of the government. It's supposed to be the representative organization that embodies the rule of law. And so to have the Attorney General somehow entangled in this scheme to exploit U.S. foreign relations, our relationship with Ukraine, to exploit the Department of Justice in order to try to punish a political opponent and in order to follow the whims of the leader. All of that, I think, is exceptionally troubling. And so I think he's going to be under incredible scrutiny. And there's, what's I think troubling what's dangerous for the Trump administration is that when they got past the Mueller report and he concluded that there wasn't anything that he could prosecute the president for, it looked like he was in the clear. But then you see what's now set in motion, and it's not just one item. You can see how all of these scandals are going to continue to roil the administration. So even if he is impeached but not removed from office, and he'll claim vindication there'll be a next set of investigations. And that's just the way it's going to go until the end of the Trump presidency.
And Frank, there were a few developments. So, for instance, recently Donald Trump has published the video, more or less, with the false information about the President Biden activities in Ukraine. That was done by the U.S. president. We also had Kurt Volker, the special envoy to Ukraine, had to resign because of his. Most probably, allegedly, because of his communication with Rudy Giuliani. So, of course, the Ukrainians are, and particularly people in the region, are very concerned, how it all would affect other Ukrainian-U.S. relations, how other parties may look at that, since still Ukraine is dependent on the U.S. Political and, all kind of the financial, military aid.
Yeah, well, I think that the Volker resignation is extremely troubling. My sense is, my instinct is that he resigned because he knew what Trump was doing was wrong and he didn't want any further part of it. I think that my impression is that he was in a very difficult position, not just because he was asked to help solve a difficult problem, in terms of negotiating a peace agreement, but also because he had a leader who was asking him to do things that I think flew in the face of his conscience. And so it'll be very interesting. He's going to testify later this week, and I think he may represent a separate problem for Trump, which is that the American national security bureaucracy and a lot of the appointees that Trump has installed in the national security bureaucracy are not people who are loyalists to Trump per se. They're Republicans who felt like they had a patriotic obligation to serve their country. And they've just kind of gone along with the mess and the circus because that's part of the deal. But there could be this moment where you see the whistleblower, you see Volker, maybe there'll be others who will come forward in the coming days who say, you know what, we don't want to be part of this corrupt, abusive show anymore, and we're going to turn against the president. But I think that there are consequences for Ukraine, which is that Volker was somebody who I think Ukrainians could feel reasonably secure was not going to sell out their interests, that he wasn't going to act against Ukrainian democracy. He wasn't going to try to impose a settlement on Ukraine that gave away too much to the Russians or somehow threatened the Ukrainian nation further. And so the question is, who comes after Volker? And the further question is how can Ukraine feel secure in its alliance with the United States when the President of the United States acts so capriciously, when he says that I may withhold your aid if you don't do exactly what I want, which seems like the subtext of this scandal. And so, if I think Ukrainians would be justified in feeling nervous about their alliance.
Frank, thanks a lot for your comment. We're waiting to hear from you more. And I just need to add that we had reached out to Mr. Walker, and he said that at this position, due to the congressional procedure, he has no opportunity to comment to any of the media. And we are joined in the studio by Sergii Leshchenko, who is the former MP and investigative journalist who is often also brought to the case by some people like Mr. Giuliani. Probably before, of course, we would like to get on with the story. You know, we've heard quite a lot from Francis. Maybe, Sergei, from the very beginning, you may say that after this, the recent scandal, Mr. Giuliani again started to speak about the possible involvement of Ukraine into the US elections in 2016. Sometimes your name was mentioned. So indeed, we know, I know it's like we can be very honest. It's not like we're playing the game. We know that many things Rudy Giuliani said just are not factually correct. Still, we have the opportunity to explain what's wrong with these allegations.
So, Mr. Giuliani, he constructed conspiracy. And this conspiracy is backed by evidence or just events fabricated in Ukraine here by Ukrainian officials or people who are not credible source. And when Mr. Giuliani say about the involvement, interference of Ukrainian government, politicians, doesn't matter, to American elections, he means decision of the court here in Kiev, which is not exist anymore, which it was cancelled totally and finally in July this year. And this was decision of the court, not a criminal court, just administrative court, created in Ukraine for the disputes between citizens and government. And this decision of the court was specifically fabricated to put some additional argument in this conspiracy. And this decision of the court...
About yourself, about you.
About me and about Anti-Corruption Bureau, which is an enforcement agency where I was now working for, but which is very important part of Ukrainian anti-corruption fight. So this whole mess is just the attempt to fill this conspiracy theory by arguments which is not relevant and sometimes just a fake.
I also like to maybe to go back what said Franklin Foer, the resignation of Mr. Walker. Which probably is felt more today by the Ukrainians. So on how can Ukraine at this stage, you think, rebuild its relations with the US? On what base?
The problem is not only with Mr. Walker, but with all vertical of relations between two countries, because as far as I heard, former Ambassador Yovanovich will be punished, Assistant Deputy Secretary of State will be punished, who was responsible for bilateral relations, and I think that other people may suffer as well. So there is no plenipotentiary ambassador of the United States in Kiev today. There is no whatever Ukrainian ambassador in the United States. And the relations between two states are in great danger. Plus, internationally, Ukraine is becoming toxic because of the whole story. Plus, internally, Ukraine international sphere becomes toxic to its own citizens. Ukrainian nationals feel a little bit puzzled, if not betrayed, by the whole story. We are in the dirt without doing something dirty. So how we would rebuild it? Well, a lot depends on the President Zelensky and Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The sending an ambassador to Washington as quick as possible is a very important thing, but also I think that some sort of political trust should be restored, And it depends a lot of the politicians. I think that Verkhovna Rada, the parliament of Ukraine, may play a special role. The Congress is leading the whole the whole process in Washington. So they should find a counterpart in Ukrainian Congress, in Ukrainian Parliament, and I think this is the most productive way.
Daria, it was mentioned that there is also in this kind of cloud of conspiracies, sometimes there are mentioned by some of the US politicians and not just such organization as National Anti-Corruption Bureau. US and anti-corruption activists are looking closely, and for a while Ukraine addresses the United States to support those organizations. So do you think this kind of help of the US is more or less not really possible, and the US can play an opposite role?
Actually, I think that the leverage of the United States to push for good reforms in Ukraine, for the good governance, is in danger, is in huge danger, and is significantly undermined. And now, whenever we will be calling Ukrainian authorities, listen, there has to be rule of law, there has to be no political interference into work of judiciary and law enforcement, they could say, okay, but show us a country in the world where there is no such interference. And many years we were pointing out to the United States, there is a country in the world with no political interference in the criminal justice. But now the President of the United States is asking the President of Ukraine to interfere into the work of Ukrainian law enforcement. So it is the damage. I understand what Franklin Foer is saying. The damage to national security of the United States is huge. And it is the damage to geopolitics of the United States. Because what the United States was selling to the world is the rule of law. And now this, leverage, the aspiration of rule of law with the United States as an example of good governance is vanishing, is disappearing.
I want to refer also to Sergei. Sergei, we will go on with that in the program, but you were not the person who was interfering in the US elections in 2016. However, you were put in the middle of the scandal. How it affected your career? Do you think it was really the reason why you started to work with Zelensky team before the President Zelensky election as a president, and then there was a scandal?
So I started to work January this year, and December last year, January this year, and we went through the whole campaign. I was present on the meeting, for instance, with Kurt Walker and Zelensky, and when Deputy Secretary of State came to Kiev, I also was on this meeting, so it was okay with American government to meet with me as a part of Zelensky team. Before, in May of this year, Mr. Giuliani made his incredibly, I believe, unprecedented statement on Fox News when he started to libel politicians, to blame them in Ukraine, to put part of this misinformation on the table for audience, and it's still the question, was he misled or it was in purpose for him to share this fake information? But he said that I'm enemy of Trump and I'm enemy of US because I interfered in American elections, which is not true, as I explained now. And of course, after this statement, it was quite unusual moment for a new president, the president-elect, because Mr. Zelensky at that moment was still president-elect, and we sat, me and some of the members of the team, and discussed this issue, and our common opinion or decision was just, since we have this statement of Giuliani, who is not just a private person, but who is a part of personal Trump team, it can be almost impossible to keep good relations with American government if I get some position in administration. And we decided that we have to at least postpone with this appointment because Giuliani is saying, and then it goes further to the White House, and this information from Giuliani will have some reflection for government relations between Ukraine and US. That is why it is not the good moment for me to get appointment in administration. So it was the clearest moment when Giuliani interfered in Ukrainian politics And if he just was saying truth, it's okay. Maybe we can accept this. But if he is saying false information, disinformation, at the same time it had reflection on Ukraine politics, I believe it's totally unacceptable.
We have also with us Andrew Kramer, who is a Moscow-based New York Times reporter. Andrew, do you hear us?
Yes, I do. Thank you
Good.
very much.
Andrew, before we start, I probably want to clarify on air one thing. The general line, sometimes it's forgotten by some of the media, is that it was sometimes it's brought up by some of the even American press, that it was Sergii, whom you just heard in our studio, who kind of opened the whole case of Manafort prior to the President Trump elections, and because he had opened this black ledger of the Party of Regions. But as we know, it was you who published in the American press the name Manafort in the black ledger of the Ukrainian Yanukovych party. So can you also let us know how it was? Because as I understand, also Mr. Giuliani sometimes says, and some other people in this cloud, that was the Ukrainian state who started that thing.
Sure. Thank you very much for letting me clarify my reporting in the summer of 2016. I had set out to do a story about Manafort's business interests in Ukraine and his business involvement with the country while he was working here. We had earlier written about his political work for the Yanukovych government. And so we looked at a number of issues related to Manafort. We looked at his investment, considered investment in a hotel in New York, together with Mr. Firtash and others. It was called the Drake Hotel, and a business deal involving a television station in Odessa called Black Sea Cable business investment. And then we were also looking at how he was paid for his political consulting work. The theory behind my reporting was we had a document come to light after the revolution in Ukraine in 2014, when many documents were found, for example, at the country home of Yanukovych, in the sauna of the former prosecutor, and in other areas, documents which would typically be secret had come to light. And the thinking was that because this one document had come out in the sauna of the former prosecutor that mentioned Manafort, maybe other official documents related to his work would be available. And my reporting approach was to ask every possible source who had access to these documents if they had found anything that mentioned Manafort. And I put in a request with the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, and the answer was that there were, in fact, mentions of Manafort in the accounting documents for political spending by the Party of Regions. This was in early August 2016. We spent some time confirming some of the information in this release. For example, we spoke with other people who had received payments through the same system, and then wrote a story that described all of Manafort's business work in Ukraine. So that was the source of, or the description of how I reported the story on Manafort and the Party of Regions accounting.
And how do you see the story developing now? Because what is, and you know, you're writing still, again, for instance, your recent article, which we are happy also to promote, is How a Shadow Foreign Policy in Ukraine Prompted an Impeachment Inquiry. I suggest people from our audience to read it carefully. I'm also already giving it to Sergii. So how you see this story is developing and to what it can lead? Because the facts are there, but still Rudy Giuliani and some people from the Trump campaign tried to argue that Ukraine interfered in these elections. So what would be your ideas? What are the most important things in this story, in the whole story, to look at and to report?
Well, I think that some of your previous guests had made very, very important points about what this means for Ukraine and for U.S.-Ukrainian relations. And I think that what might happen, it's hard to predict the future, but this is likely to go to an impeachment vote in the U.S. Congress and will continue to be a high-profile story in Ukraine and the United States in the coming weeks and months. I think the emphasis on there are two stories here. One is what President Trump has said is the real scandal, which is the idea that former Vice President Biden and his son had behaved inappropriately in Ukraine and perhaps made money illegally in Ukraine in the case of Mr. Biden's son. And then the second point that Mr. Trump and Giuliani raise is this idea of Ukrainian meddling. So there are two competing scandals and narratives here. One is that there's something to be found out about what Trump wants to look into, and the other is how Trump had pursued these investigations, how he had sought this information, which was possibly leveraging American foreign policy. So it's my experience, based on the reporting that I described, that the information did not come from a leak on Manafort. It came from a statement from a named organization, a written statement from a law enforcement organization. The director of that organization has gone on the record describing why he released the information and saying it was released lawfully. I think some of the reporting and some of the discussion of how the Manafort information first came to light has suggested, without any proof, some sort of mysterious or secret backroom dealings, when in fact it was a perfectly sourced and written statement.
Thank you, Andrew, and good luck with your following stories here in Ukraine. I know a lot of foreign reporters are coming to Kyiv and trying to explain something which had been already explained many times. But thanks a lot. I also would encourage our audience to support the independent media like Hromadske, so you can donate to allow our independent work. The donate button is at our webpage en.hromadske.ua on the top right part of it. That's for your information, so please also follow our social media, Facebook and Twitter. But before going to the other international relations, I want to also discuss one issue which is important in Ukraine. That's in particular the quote and the part of the conversation by President Zelensky on how he would deal with the issue. So I would like our team to bring the quote.
Мій товариш, це правда. Мій товариш. Так, вся моя команда – це мої люди. Це не власність моя. Я їм не наказую, що робити. Ми пройшли довгий якийсь шлях виборчої кампанії. Пан генпрокурор Рябошапка, він же ж не хотів бути генпрокурором. Ви знаєте про це? Він не хотів. Так, він хотів працювати в офісі президента, тому що ми завжди працювали однією командою. Скільки ми працювали? 7 місяців. Да? Так. Моя людина – це не моя власність. Просто мій товариш. І я цим пишаюсь.
That was President Zelensky answer, in particular, also to our question after the General Assembly speech on the General Prosecutor Rябошапka, the Ukrainian General Prosecutor, who, in the conversation with Trump, was named to be 100% my man, or there was no man because it wasn't clear. Would it be a female? My person, yeah. But that was quite a huge, with the reason, the discussion in Ukraine. Sergei, you just started to say that you were also a person who knew Mr. Rябошапka. You more or less joined.
Yeah, I can confirm that Ruslan Rябошапka didn't want to be Prosecutor General. This issue raised a few times when election campaign was, and after a victory, Rябошапka really wanted to be focused on issues of presidential office, on legislation, on preparing the draft law. So his role as a Prosecutor General more like compromise with president. So I'm not sure that he wanted to be on such position. And when we look on the context of this statement, it doesn't look like Zelensky wants to operate by Prosecutor General. He just wanted to change narrative of Trump, because Trump was focused that you have to leave Mr. Lutsenko, because for me, as for Trump, he's a credible person because he agreed to help me with Biden. And Zelensky said, I cannot do this if we paraphrase this, but I will have my prosecutor and he will look on this process. To know better situation, you have to know Ruslan Rябошапka. He was the person who left voluntarily team of anti-corruption agency, position of the member of anti-corruption because of the pressure, because he is not the person who accepts the pressure. That is why I totally understand what Zelensky meant. He means that this person will be from my team, he will have a fresh look on this case, and he will make opinion. And I would not recommend to consider this as an attempt to privatize Prosecutor General as a property.
In the Ukrainian political language, last 5 years, the words "my team" is absolutely normal. Every political leader says "my team," "my people," "moja komanda." This is something absolutely appropriate for Ukrainian language without
my nation.
Leshchenko was started with that, without meaning that these people are the puppets or something like that. So this is not the case.
Does it sound for you persuasive as anti-corruption activist?
I didn't like this phrase, but I agree with Sergei that first. Zelensky tried to do everything to not to disappoint Trump. So he was actually confirming everything what Trump was saying. And I can understand why. And second thing, I personally also know Ruslan Rябошапka. And I think that he will be, the person who can resist pressure coming from the president or whoever else. So
there are some examples. For instance, he was pressed to leave Mr. Keys as his deputy, but he resigned, this person, he fired him. So there is even now examples that in Prosecutor General office he can deal or deliver independently.
So to move on in order, I also would like to look in another angle of this story, and of course another way where Mr. Zelensky was more or less flattering Mr. Trump was his comments on the European states and their not enough of support to Ukraine. We have with us Marie Mendra, who is a political scientist in the field of post-Soviet studies and one of the best analysts from France, knowing our region. Marie, good evening.
Good evening.
So, Marie, also, of course, we're looking. We now have a lot of voices from the DC and also from Kiev, but of course, we are very much concerned that how this, what it was flattering beyond the acceptable by Mr. Zelensky in his conversation with Mr. Trump, how it's seen from Paris, and where particularly there were not much good said about President Macron.
Mm-hmm. Well, it certainly was a sad moment of humiliation for President Zelensky and also for President Trump to have this very careless conversation over the phone. And I think it is more humiliating for them and more of a problem for both of them than from President Macron or Chancellor Merkel. It just shows how complicated this Ukraine-Russia conflict is, and it's not that easy to just decide, like the French president did, in July, that one could just go ahead and make progress with the new president Zelensky, with Vladimir Putin, and reach a deal. And unfortunately, now all parties are stuck.
So, Marie, also probably I would ask you to go on with that, because indeed a few weeks ago it felt like a bit of momentum, because there was on the serious levels a discussion about the possible meeting at Normandy Forum of the leaders of 4 states in Paris, which even the dates were mentioned, first mid of September, later mid of October. So you think that process would be stopped, but as well maybe you would go, how indeed this could influence the Ukraine-French relations and the Ukraine-Europe relations?
Well, first, I'll start, I think, with the wishful thinking that everybody was trying to diffuse and promote in Paris, Kiev, Berlin, Washington, that if the Donbass war had not been put to a stop, it was just that we hadn't found the right method. So when I was in Kiev mid-September, it was very clear to me that most of my interlocutors, including your new government, just we're trying to sell progress in relations with Russia that they didn't really believe in. So there's been a lot of wishful thinking. Now the problem is what to do with the high expectations since August of a Normandy format summit in Paris that would, change the odds. Clearly, we don't have a date, so it is postponed, but we don't have a date for this summit. And it seems that none of the preconditions now are met. Now, what I'd like to add is that the Minsk process since 2014-15 has never stopped as a process. The process is on. There are many meetings, not at the level of heads of states and prime ministers, but there are meetings regularly, and the process is still on. We just need now to go beyond this political strategic deadlock.
So just shortly, so to what extent Mr. Zelensky comment was discussed in Paris, or there was general discussion about the whole conversation?
I think the scandal was huge, but as you can guess, the French TV viewer, radio listener was more into this amazing pressure from Donald Trump personally to asking President Zelensky to interfere in domestic U.S. affairs. So, we Europeans have lived with this Trump problem now for 3 years. And this is what we're most concerned about. So I would say that President Zelensky was very careless. He certainly damaged his reputation. But it seems to me that the French authorities, the German authorities, are prepared to continue and go ahead and work with him and with his government, because simply there are no other choices, and because we all together face one very difficult partner in this negotiation. It's Vladimir Putin. So we still have to be together to try and make Vladimir Putin move from his position of just no compromise on Donbass.
Marie, thanks a lot for your clarification. That was Marie Mendra, the political analyst and scientist in the field of post-Soviet studies in France. My probably short comment as well to finalize this part of the story. You've been for some time the permanent representative of Ukraine in the European Union. Also, how do you see this? The Ukrainian diplomats can now pursue with their European partners after this conversation.
They are all working now in all European capitals to restore the normalcy in our relations with these capitals, as well as in Brussels, of course. Our ambassadors, both in France and Germany, are working hard, and the whole Ukrainian diplomats do. I think that Europeans understand that there was a case of unpreparedness at the same time, and just newly elected president was not ready to such visible pressure as the American president made. Unfortunately, it weakens the position of Ukraine vis-à-vis European Union and in the next possible Normandy summit, and that is why it would be better to postpone this summit as much as possible.
I would like also, many people ask us, so what do Ukrainians think? We, of course, went to the streets of Kiev and asked them whether they care about the scandal. So here are the answers.
I don't think there's any scandal. What's Ukraine have to do with it? Zelensky managed to get out of the situation. At the very least, he didn't embarrass himself.
I don't know. How can it affect us? Ukraine takes up such a small spot on the international stage that I don't know how it can affect us. Maybe during the elections something will come out with Trump and Hunter Biden, but I don't know.
Definitely you will. Because everything that happens on that level results in some sort of pressure. We're mixed up in this situation, so it will definitely have an effect.
I haven't followed the political situation, but I wouldn't say it's a scandal. Only time will tell. How do we know what kind of effect it'll have? Let the US figure out their own business before judging what effect it'll have on Ukraine. If there is going to be some effect on us, it'll be far down the line. On military aid? I don't know. Probably it will be decided after the impeachment process in the US. But in the history of the United States, not a single impeachment process has ended successfully.
Scandals are necessary. Even in a relationship between a man and a woman, if everything is good and calm, it's boring. So any crisis reboots the system. We've long had a need to reboot our system because everything somehow has become boring and predictable. I support change, for the world to change or Ukraine to change. If this somehow sparks a new world, then probably it's for the best. It's high time for people to know Ukraine, not only for football players or boxers, but because we can become better, probably. You know, if we were in an ideal world without corruption, then the scandal with Trump would be notable. But if it's corrupt, then it draws in these corrupt possibilities. It's sweet. Corruption is like a sweet, like a chocolate. And for us, for our entire history as an independent country, we're so in love with this powdered sugar that maybe a person may not have even wanted, but it was too sweet to turn down. Everyone wants to live well, so corruption is, if you had asked me how it looks, then it's a woman who's pretty and sweet, though of course with her own minuses.
I think the scandal will have a positive effect, because a lot of unexpected doors will open that previously were closed. I think we'll learn something that the government had hidden from Ukrainian citizens for some time. Yes, I think that a lot of different interesting facts will be uncovered in these different agreements. I'm not ready to say anything because the press currently has put forward completely different narratives. I think that we need to wait a week or two to really understand what's going on.
It's a completely made-up situation that everyone will forget about in a few weeks. The world needs scandals, so here it is. No, I don't think it will affect Ukrainian politics. I think that it won't affect our relations with European partners either. In 2 weeks there will be another scandal.
So that's what the Kyiv residents thought. To finalize the discussions, we had one still thing to brought into it. Still, what are the things to be concerned if we are finalizing this talk?
The ultimate beneficiary of all this scandal is Russia, and our bipartisan support of the United States to Ukraine is under great risk. It is a complicated story, so therefore we see that most of citizens of Ukraine don't get it. But the impact could be very dramatically negative on Ukraine, because we can be left alone, probably not alone, but with Europeans only, to resist pressure from Vladimir Putin. And the military aggression from Russia could actually expand. So I think that we have to not underestimate the impact of this conflict, the impact of this scandal. And another thing, it still has to be investigated what was the source of all these narratives. Who was backing up Giuliani with the facts apart from Leshchenko? It was not Leshchenko who created the narrative. He was playing the role created by someone else. And it was not Giuliani who was creating all this narrative. He was actually giving it to President Trump. But it was, we are missing here some people and some organizations who were putting this all together.
I can only remind that Mr. Leshchenko started his political career with very close relations with Russian organization called the Luzhnikovsky Group or Energy Corporation.
We're getting to another.
But they really financed him and his political force. This group is headed by former deputy of Speaker of Russian Duma, Russian Parliament, Mr. Babakov. So it's not a joke; it's a serious issue.
We shouldn't spread conspiracies, but what I'm saying that it has to be investigated. It is out of the equation now who actually put it all together, but there has to be more light on who developed all that.
And also remember that Mr. Leshchenko disappeared from Ukraine. He is not in Ukraine anymore, with the official purpose to study English in London or somewhere. But he just disappeared, understanding that it can be quite, let's say, stormy time for him.
Let's separate two things. One, let's sort out from where comes the whole story. But the other one is the importance of have professionals in all spheres of governmental affairs, and especially in the foreign affairs. What the case teaches us is that international relations become, because of globalization, become vital and very important for every Ukrainian interest in economy, in politics, in human relations, etc. We lack professionals in this sphere by now, and the presidency should think about it.
Before we finish, I would like also to remind about one final thing. Still, there is one company a lot of foreign reporters would like to investigate. It's the company Burisma. Maybe there are some things to tell more about that. Sometimes we feel ourselves, tired of being repetitive. But I would like also to show one comment of another investigative British journalist, Oliver Bullough, who was investigated this company years before, and our colleagues had a chance to talk to him way earlier. So we would watch the piece of it and answer to the question to what extent the dismissal of the former prosecutor and the whole scandal with Biden are connected, if they are.
Dismissal of Prosecutor General shocking, and the fact that the son of Joe Biden was working in Burisma company under investigations.
There is no connection between these two facts. Hunter Biden one of his jobs was to work for a Ukrainian businessman, a former minister in the Yanukovych's administration. That's one fact. The other fact is that Joe Biden was in charge of Ukraine policy for the White House and demanded that the general prosecutor of Ukraine be sacked. But the general prosecutor of Ukraine was not actively investigating the company for which Hunter Biden worked. There was no possible advantage to Hunter Biden from Shokin, the general prosecutor, being fired. There was no conceivable material advantage. Even if there was a material advantage, if you look at how much money Hunter Biden was earning, he earned cumulatively something like $3.5 million. The idea that $3.5 million would sway the foreign policy of the United States is so ridiculous that it's extraordinary anyone would even take that seriously.
So it was taken very seriously, and I encourage you also to watch the full interview with Oliver Bullough at our webpage en.hromadsky.ua. And for the final comment, Daria, my question is if now Ukrainian general prosecutor would start to investigate Burisma, it would always seen as something. Was it the pressure from the President Trump or something? How do you think that could be dealt?
Well, first, I don't think that there is evidence left to investigate. Since 2014, this case was sacked so many times. from one agency to another, sold
many times.
So I doubt that there is something to investigate there. It's the first thing. Second thing, even if someone will decide to investigate it, Burisma, it will be the period of time before Hunter Biden joined Burisma. It's the first thing. And second thing, even if there is some evidence, after all this scandal, I can't imagine a single Ukrainian investigator or prosecutor who could feel no pressure when investigating this case.
And Sergei, the final word to you still, what are you planning to do? Because the story is involving, your name is still repeated by the US media. You keep answering that. And I'm afraid it may last till the elections, at least for another year. What are you going to do with this?
I'm going to receive the answer from US Congress. Are they interested on my witness or not? Because I agreed on my publication in Washington Post that I can provide information on what happened here, at least from my knowledge and my understanding. And I believe it's important to state the truth, what happened really, and what was just conspiracy theory, and what was just a fake news. Second, life is going on, and I agree with my fellow citizens saying that in 2 weeks it's going to be next scandal, and it will put current scandal into the shadow. So in the US it will go on, but in Ukraine it's always something new going on. So we'll see. And regarding my plans, you will know it as soon as it happened.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ukraine got new president, new government, and new parliament under the banner of reform, of deep reforms. I think that quicker the proclaimed reforms would happen, less damage we will have from this story, because these governmental officials will show to both Europeans and Americans that Ukraine is not a dirty country, Ukraine is not the nest of corruption, Ukraine is not the former Soviet Union state. Ukraine is newly born European nation, which is a good partner for all these major forces.
I totally agree. I don't want to leave the last word by me, but each crisis creates challenges, but opportunities. And now it's a good chance to explain to the world again what is going on here, now in Ukraine. How reshuffle of power happened, how hundreds of new people joined parliament. We have total reshuffle of Prosecutor General office. We established anti-corruption court. And now it's a chance to show better face of Ukraine compared to what was a few years ago when corrupt scandal was the main synonymous for Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. We started this with Daria, that also a lot of shady things are coming to the light, so it's good time to investigate. So thanks a lot for the quite a lengthy discussion, but we really wanted our foreign audience to get into the details in what is missed in maybe some more concise programs. So thanks a lot for being with us, and follow us on Twitter and Facebook, search Hromadske International, go to en.hromadske.ua webpage. Also sign up for our weekly newsletter. There you can also find the most important of our stories. And with this, I say goodbye.